The night was quiet, the highway nearly deserted. Nevin Palasker drove with one hand on the wheel, his eyes scanning the dark stretch of road ahead. It was late, past midnight, and the only light came from the faint yellow glow of his headlights cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with humidity, and the occasional chirp of crickets could be heard over the low hum of his car's engine. It was supposed to be just another long drive home, but before the night was over, Nevin would learn a painful lesson, a lesson that would scar him forever. Nevin had been traveling along an H-48, a long, winding highway in India known for its isolated stretches of road and eerie silence at night. He was used to these drives. He often visited his parents in another town and then drove home late to avoid traffic. The route was familiar, but something about that night felt different. Maybe it was the way the sky seemed darker than usual, the stars hidden behind thick clouds. Maybe it was the unnatural stillness of the air, like the world was holding its breath. Or maybe it was the rock sitting in the middle of the road, a large, jagged boulder, right in his lane, and it was placed too perfectly to be an accident. Nevin cursed under his breath and slowed the car to a stop. He glanced in his rearview mirror. Nothing but empty road stretching behind him. Not a single pair of headlights in sight. For a brief moment, unease crept up his spine. Something about this didn't feel right. Why would a rock this big be here? Had it fallen from a truck? Rolled down from a nearby hill? Or had someone put it there on purpose? Nevin shook the thought away. He was being paranoid. It was just a rock. He threw on his hazard lights, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the obstacle. The night air was hot and heavy, sticking to his skin. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves, carried by the faintest breeze. The rock was heavy, but he could push it if he tried. Just a minute of effort, and he'd be back on his way. But the second he touched it, his car exploded. A deafening boom tore through the night. The force of the blast sent Nevin flying backward, his body slamming against the pavement. His ears rang violently, his vision blurred. Heat engulfed the air, turning the darkness into a bright, fiery inferno. For a moment, Nevin couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All he could do was stare in horror as his car was consumed by flames. What the hell just happened? The fire roared, swallowing the vehicle whole. The windshield burst, sending shards of glass scattering across the road. Thick, black smoke curled into the night sky, filling his lungs with its choking presence. Nevin forced himself to move, crawling away from the heat as pain shot through his body. His arms and legs were burning, scraped raw from the impact. His head throbbed, his thoughts a jumbled mess. His car, his only way out of here, was gone. And then, as he staggered to his feet, he heard something worse. Footsteps, coming from the trees. Nevin's blood ran cold. Someone was watching him. Someone had set this up, and now they were coming to finish the job. His breathing turned ragged as he scanned the tree line, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. He couldn't see them, but he could feel them. They were there, just beyond the firelight, waiting, watching. And then, a voice. Low, amused. You should have kept driving. Nevin didn't think. He ran. His legs screamed in protest, his skin raw from the heat and scrapes, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He didn't know where he was going. Just away from the fire, away from the road, away from them. He sprinted toward the dense jungle that bordered the highway, praying it would be enough to lose them. Behind him, the footsteps quickened. They were chasing him, and they were fast. Nevin's chest burned as he weaved through the trees, branches slashing at his arms, his legs stumbling over roots. His breath came in sharp gasps, his vision swimming from the smoke he had inhaled. He couldn't outrun them, but maybe, just maybe, he could hide. Up ahead, a large tree with thick, gnarled roots came into view. Without thinking, he dove beneath it, pressing himself into the dirt, willing himself to be silent. The footsteps slowed, then stopped, right in front of him. Nevin clamped a hand over his mouth, fighting to keep his breathing quiet. He could see them now, silhouettes standing in the firelight. 3, no, 4 of them. They stood there, motionless, their heads tilted like they were listening. Then, one of them spoke. He's not dead. Another answered. Doesn't matter. He won't last the night. A cruel laugh. Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone, slipping back into the darkness, leaving nothing behind, except for the burning wreckage of his car. Nevin didn't move for a long time. His entire body trembled, his skin slick with sweat, his mind replaying their words over and over again. Who were they? Why had they done this? And, most terrifying of all, had this happened before? Had others stopped for a rock in the road and never made it out? He didn't know, and he didn't want to. All he wanted was to get out of there. It took hours for him to find help. By the time he reached a police outpost, his body was on the verge of collapse. He told them everything. They searched the area, but when they got there, the car was gone. Not burned, not destroyed, just gone, like it had never been there at all. To this day, no one knows who was behind it. No suspects, no leads, just a single survivor. A man left with permanent burn scars and a fear of night drives he'll never escape. Because now, Nevin knows the truth. Sometimes, when you're driving alone at night, and you see something in the road, it's not there by accident, and stopping might be the last thing you ever do. The highway was nearly deserted, stretching endlessly into the dark countryside. The hum of the tires against the asphalt filled the car, a steady rhythm that should have been comforting. But it wasn't. Not tonight, because something felt wrong. Lucas gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, his knuckles white. His wife, Sophia, sat beside him, her gaze flicking to the side mirror every few minutes. In the back seat, their two children, Mia, 8, and Leo, 5, slept soundly, their soft breathing the only thing keeping Lucas grounded. They were heading home after visiting family in a neighboring state, choosing to drive through the night to avoid traffic. It had seemed like a good idea at first. The roads were clear, and they had made good time. But now, they were on a lonely stretch of highway, deep in rural Brazil, with nothing but darkness ahead and behind them. And that's when the headlights appeared, bright, unblinking, following them. And no matter how fast Lucas drove, they didn't go away. At first, he thought it was just another traveler, someone on the same route. But after 20 minutes, the car was still behind them. And then, it moved closer. Lucas's jaw tightened. They're tailgating us. Sophia glanced in the mirror, her brows knitting together. Maybe they just want to pass? Lucas slowed down slightly, edging to the side of the road, giving the car space to overtake them. But it didn't. Instead, the car slowed down too, matching their speed, shadowing their every move. Sophia's fingers curled around the seatbelt. That's not normal. No, it wasn't. Something was wrong. Lucas wasn't a paranoid man. He had driven these roads plenty of times before. But now, his gut screamed at him. This was a trap. He checked the fuel gauge, half a tank. They could outrun them if they had to. But then, up ahead, another set of headlights, coming straight at them. Lucas's heart slammed against his ribs. Two cars, one behind, one ahead, boxing them in. Sophia gasped, grabbing his arm. Lucas. His mind raced. He could slam the brakes, try to turn around. But what if they had others waiting? What if this was planned? His stomach churned. Then the car in front swerved, blocking the road completely. And Lucas knew. They were trapped. The cars stopped at the same time. Doors opened. Figures stepped out, their silhouettes barely visible in the moonlight. Lucas counted 4 men, maybe 5. One of them carried a gun. Sophia's breathing quickened. Lucas, what do we do? His mind raced. The kids were still asleep, thank God. If they had been awake, if they had started crying, if these men got nervous. Lucas didn't want to think about that. Stay calm, he whispered. But Sophia's hands were trembling. The men approached, and then they knocked on the window. Lucas didn't move. His instinct screamed at him to hit the gas, plow through them, do anything to escape. But there were too many. And the gun, it was already pointed at them. One of the men, tall, thin, with a scar running down his cheek, leaned closer. Step out of the car. His voice was calm, too calm. Lucas didn't move. Another man, shorter, stockier, holding a crowbar, tapped it against the glass. Now. Lucas glanced at Sophia. Her eyes were wide, her breath shaky, but she nodded. Slowly, carefully, Lucas unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. The second his foot touched the pavement, the man shoved him against the car. Hands searched his pockets, yanking out his wallet, his phone. The other men did the same to Sophia, pulling her from the car, tearing her purse from her shoulder. She didn't fight. Lucas wanted to, but with the kids in the back seat, he couldn't risk it. Then, one of them, the man with the gun, looked at Sophia. His eyes flicked to her necklace, a thin, delicate gold chain. "Take it off." Sophia's fingers tightened around it instinctively. Lucas felt his heart stop. "No, please," Sophia whispered. "It was my mother's." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I wasn't asking." Lucas reacted before he could think. He stepped forward, blocking Sophia from the man's reach. "Take everything else," Lucas said, his voice steady. "Just leave that." A long, heavy silence. Then, a sharp click. The safety on the gun. Lucas's blood ran cold. Then, a gunshot. The world tilted. A sharp, burning pain exploded in Lucas's chest. He staggered backward, his breath catching, his hands flying to his shirt. Warm, wet, blood. Sophia screamed. The kids woke up, Mia's terrified wail piercing through the night. And then, the men ran. They grabbed what they could, wallets, bags, whatever was easy. And then they were gone, vanishing into the night, leaving Lucas bleeding on the road. Sophia was screaming. She pressed her hands against the wound, desperate to stop the bleeding. Lucas tried to speak, to tell her it was okay, that they were safe now, but he couldn't. The pain was too much. His vision blurred. The last thing he saw was Mia's tiny hands clutching his shirt. The last thing he heard was Sophia's voice, pleading with him to stay awake. And then, everything went dark. When Lucas woke up, he was in a hospital bed. The room was dim, the steady beep of a heart monitor the only sound. Sophia was beside him, holding his hand. She looked exhausted. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. "Don't talk," Sophia whispered, eyes filled with tears. "Just rest." Lucas swallowed. "The kids." She smiled, brushing a hand over his forehead. "They're okay. They're safe." Relief washed over him. But then Sophia's expression changed, darkened. "They never found them," she murmured. Lucas didn't need to ask who. The men, the ones who had trapped them, robbed them, shot him. They had disappeared, vanished like ghosts. And no one, not the police, not the neighbors, not the cameras, had seen a thing. They never drove at night again. Lucas healed, but the scars remained. And every time they passed that stretch of highway, every time they saw an empty road under the moonlight, they remembered. Because somewhere out there, in the darkness, the men who did this were still watching, still waiting, for the next car to stop, for the next family to trap. The night was supposed to be uneventful. I had done this drive dozens of times before. Just a long stretch of highway, a full tank of gas, and nothing but the quiet hum of the engine to keep me company. But that night was different. That night, I learned that sometimes, when you're driving alone at night, you aren't really alone. Because something followed me. And no matter what I did, no matter how fast I drove or how many turns I took, it wouldn't let me go. It started about an hour into the drive. I had just finished a late shift at work and was heading home, taking the old highway that cut through miles of empty countryside. It was the fastest route, though not the safest. Barely any street lights, no gas stations, just endless road. I didn't mind. I liked driving at night, the peace of it, the quiet. But that night, something felt wrong. The air inside the car felt thicker, heavier somehow. The kind of silence that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. And then, I saw the headlights. A car, far behind me at first. Then, slowly, getting closer. At first, I didn't think anything of it. It was just another car, another late-night driver. But after 10 minutes, I noticed something strange. Every time I sped up, they did too. When I slowed down, they matched my speed. They never tried to pass, never drifted too far behind. Just stayed there, following. My hands tightened around the wheel. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. Maybe they just happened to be going the same way. But then I did something to test them. I changed lanes. And so did they. My stomach tightened. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was following me. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Think, think, think. What were my options? There were no exits for miles. No towns, no gas stations. Just road and darkness. I checked my phone. No signal. Of course. The road stretched ahead, endless and empty. The only other car was them. A shadow in my mirrors, their headlights glaring. And then, they flicked their high beams. Once, then again, like a signal, a warning, or a game. I felt a cold wave of fear settle in my chest. This wasn't just some random driver. They wanted me to know they were there. I pressed the gas, pushing past 70 miles per hour. The road was straight, smooth. If I could just lose them. The car behind me sped up. Easily, effortlessly. Like they were waiting for this. Like they were playing. I clenched my jaw, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. No, 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 no. I wasn't going to let them trap me out here. Then, up ahead, I saw it. A gas station. The only one for miles. A single flickering light above the pumps, an empty lot, a small convenience store. It was my only chance. Without hesitating, I yanked the wheel to the right, swerving into the parking lot so fast my tires screeched. I pulled up right in front of the store, where the lights were brightest. Then, I looked back. The car had stopped at the edge of the lot. Not pulling in, not turning away, just sitting there, waiting, watching. I could feel them, eyes locked on me through the darkness. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. For the first time that night, I considered getting out of the car, running into the store, asking the clerk for help, but something stopped me. A gut feeling, a quiet voice in the back of my head that whispered, "Don't go outside," because something told me, if I stepped out of the car, I wouldn't make it inside. The store lights buzzed. The road beyond was silent. And then, the car slowly backed up. Then, without turning, without hesitation, it drove away. I watched it disappear down the highway, my breath still shallow, my hands still trembling. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't, because something about the way it left felt wrong. Not like they had given up, not like they had decided to stop. More like, they were just waiting, waiting for another chance, waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting for the next time I drove alone at night. I stayed at the gas station for almost an hour. When I finally got back on the road, my chest was still tight, my heart still racing. I checked my mirrors every few seconds, my skin crawling at the thought that they might come back. But they didn't. I never saw them again. Not that night, not on that stretch of road. But even now, months later, I still think about them. Every time I drive alone at night. Every time I see headlights in my rearview mirror. And every time I wonder, what would have happened if I had stopped? Or worse, what if I had never pulled into that gas station at all? The road stretched endlessly ahead, swallowed in darkness. The only light came from the dim glow of the streetlights flickering in the distance and the occasional headlights of passing cars. The night air was thick, heavy with the scent of asphalt and the distant hum of crickets beyond the roadside. For most of the passengers on the overnight bus, it was just another late-night trip. Some were sleeping, heads resting against the cool windows, while others sat in silence, watching the empty road ahead or scrolling through their phones. No one knew that in just a few moments, their quiet journey would turn into a nightmare. No one knew that before the night was over, they would fear for their lives. I was sitting near the back of the bus, headphones in, trying to drown out the quiet murmur of conversations and the low rumble of the engine. It wasn't my first time traveling at night. In fact, I preferred it. Less traffic, fewer stops, an easier ride. The bus was about half full, a mix of students, workers, and a few older passengers. Some sat alone, others traveled in pairs or small groups. A couple of young guys near the front were quietly chatting, and an older man across the aisle was flipping through a newspaper, the rustling of the pages barely audible. The driver sat in his seat, hands steady on the wheel, his focus locked on the winding highway ahead. Every now and then, He'd adjust his mirrors, glancing at the passengers through the reflection. Everything felt normal, until the bus slowed down. At first, I thought we were stopping for another passenger, but then I noticed the roadblock ahead. A few large plastic barriers had been placed haphazardly across the road, forcing the driver to slow to a crawl. There were no police officers, no emergency vehicles, just a few figures standing near the barriers, barely illuminated by the bus's headlights. My stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. The driver hesitated, his hands tightening on the wheel. Then, before anyone could react, the figures rushed forward. The first one slammed a hand against the windshield. Another yanked open the bus door before the driver could react. Then, suddenly, 4 men were inside. The moment they stepped onto the bus, everything changed. The soft murmurs turned to screams. The quiet hum of the engine was replaced by shouting, the sharp bark of commands. A gunshot rang out. The sound exploded through the air, and just like that, the entire bus fell silent. One of the men, tall, muscular, wearing a black ski mask, lifted his gun and pointed it directly at the driver's head. "Keep driving," he ordered. The driver, his hands visibly shaking, obeyed. The doors shut, sealing us inside. The bus lurched forward, rolling past the barricades and back onto the road. But now, we weren't in control. The men had taken over, and we had nowhere to go. I could hear someone crying softly a few rows ahead. Another whispering, praying. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, hoping, praying, that if I didn't move, they wouldn't notice me. The leader, the one holding the gun, stepped into the aisle. His eyes scanned the passengers, his lips curling into a satisfied smirk beneath his mask. "Wallets, phones, everything you've got," he said. His voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that sent chills down my spine. The other men moved through the rows, shoving backpacks, purses, anything they could grab into large plastic bags. One of them, a younger guy, jittery, nervous, grabbed a woman's phone and snapped it in half. "No calls," he muttered. Another man ripped a gold chain from an old man's neck. "Please," the old man whispered. "That was my wife's." A fist to his stomach cut him off. He doubled over, gasping for breath. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms, forcing myself not to react, because I knew that if I did, I might not survive. Then, something worse happened. One of the younger passengers, a guy sitting near the front, made a stupid decision. He thought he could be a hero. He thought he could fight back. He was wrong. It happened fast. One moment, he was sitting still, eyes darting between the men as if trying to gauge an escape. The next, he lunged. He grabbed at one of the hijackers, trying to wrestle the gun from his hands. Another shot rang out. Screams. Blood. The young man slumped forward, his body crumpling into the aisle. For a second, everything froze. Then, the leader turned his gun toward the driver again. "That was your only warning," he said. "Next time, I won't miss." Nobody moved after that. We sat there, silent, terrified, clutching our belongings, hoping they wouldn't take more than what they already had, hoping they wouldn't decide to kill us all. The bus continued down the road, rolling further into the empty darkness, further away from any chance of help. I kept my head down, my heart pounding so loud I thought they'd hear it. I didn't know how this would end. I just knew that if something didn't happen soon, we might never make it out alive. Then, headlights appeared behind us. Bright, blinding headlights. A car. No, several cars. And they were gaining on us fast. The leader noticed it too. He turned, cursing under his breath. Then, flashing red and blue lights. Police. Somehow, someway, they had found us. And the moment they did, everything turned to chaos. The leader shouted orders. The men panicked, yelling at the driver to speed up. But the police were already beside us, cutting us off, forcing us to stop. The second the bus jerked to a halt, the doors burst open. Gunshots filled the air. The hijackers fought back, but it was over. The police swarmed the bus, tackling the men to the floor, pinning them down. One tried to run. He didn't make it. When it was finally over, when the men were dragged off in cuffs, the passengers sat there, shaken, silent. We had survived. But none of us would ever forget that night. None of us would ever feel safe on the road again. Because now, we knew the truth. We knew that sometimes, when you're driving through the night, the real monsters aren't the ones in your nightmares. They're the ones sitting beside you. Juan Gonzalez had spent the last 20 years on the road. Truck driving wasn't just his job, it was his entire life. He knew the highways better than he knew his own house. He knew which gas stations had the cleanest bathrooms, which diners had the best coffee, and which roads to avoid after dark. Most importantly, he knew one unspoken rule that all truckers followed when driving through cartel territory in Mexico. Never stop. Not for strangers. Not for roadside accidents. Not for anything. Because sometimes, what looked like an accident was really a trap. And sometimes, stopping meant you wouldn't make it to your destination. Juan had followed that rule his entire career. Until the night he didn't. Until the night he made his last delivery. It was just after midnight when Juan's tires rumbled over the cracked asphalt of the highway. The desert stretched for miles on either side. An endless sea of darkness. The only signs of life were the occasional flickering headlights of distant cars and the glow of cigarette embers from passing truckers who, like him, still had miles to go before morning. The job was simple: haul a trailer full of electronics from Mexico City to the U.S. border. He had done it 100 times before, but this time, something felt off. Maybe it was the way his boss had hesitated before giving him the assignment. Maybe it was the way his radio had gone strangely silent once he passed the last toll booth. Or maybe it was the black SUV that had been following him for the last 30 miles. He first noticed it an hour ago. At first, he thought nothing of it. Plenty of people traveled these roads at night. Other truckers, tourists, even cartel members. But then, when he sped up, so did the SUV. When he slowed down, it stayed right behind him. It never tried to pass, never honked, just followed. That's when the unease in Juan's stomach turned to something worse. Something that made his hands tighten on the wheel. Something that made his heartbeat quicken. Because he had heard the stories before. Truckers disappearing. Bodies found in the desert, stripped of anything valuable. Cargo stolen. Some were lucky enough to just be robbed. Others weren't so fortunate. And Juan had no intention of becoming one of those stories. So he did what he always told himself he'd do in a situation like this. He didn't stop. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The SUV was still there. Then, up ahead, Juan spotted something in the road. A car. Wrecked. Steam hissed from its crumpled hood, and a lone figure stood beside it, waving desperately. Juan's stomach dropped. It was a trap. It had to be. The SUV behind him. The wreck in front. They were trying to box him in. He had seconds to react. What do I do? If he stopped, he was as good as dead. If he swerved, he might lose control of the truck. And if they were armed, that wouldn't matter anyway. But then, Juan's headlights swept over the wrecked car, and he saw the woman. She wasn't just waving. She was screaming. Her face was pale, streaked with blood, her hands trembling. And behind her, in the shadows, was a man, standing completely still, watching, waiting. Juan's instinct screamed at him to keep going. But then the woman collapsed to her knees. She wasn't faking. She was hurt. Juan gritted his teeth, his hands clenching around the wheel. He couldn't just leave her. He had sisters, a mother. If this was real, if she really needed help, he had to do something. So he made his choice. He stopped. The second Juan's truck slowed, the SUV behind him revved its engine. Juan barely had time to turn his head before the SUV swerved into the other lane, blocking his path. His stomach plummeted. A trap. Of course it was a trap. Before he could throw the truck into reverse. Gunshots. The windshield shattered. Juan ducked, heart slamming against his ribs as the glass sprayed across the dashboard. More shots, hitting metal, hitting rubber. The truck lurched as the front tires blew out. He was stuck, and they were coming. The next few moments were a blur. The SUV's doors burst open, and men poured out, masked, armed, moving fast. They ripped open the truck's door before Juan could even reach for his gun. A fist slammed into his temple, and suddenly, the world tilted. He hit the ground hard, the taste of blood in his mouth. The woman was gone. She had never been real. just part of the trap. The last thing Juan saw before everything went black was the masked men climbing into his truck and driving it away. They found Juan's body 3 days later. His truck was long gone. His cargo? Vanished. The police launched an investigation, but there were no leads, no suspects. Just another ghost story told among truckers. A warning whispered in the dead of night at rest stops. Never stop. Not for strangers. Not for wrecks. Not for anyone. Because out there, on those lonely roads, you might not be the only one driving through the night. And sometimes, stopping means you don't leave alive.